She was never supposed to be found. For 10 years, Meredith Ashford had kept the family's entire hotel empire breathing from a windowless records room in the basement of the Ashford Grand, while her father collected the praise and her brother collected the women. Then one November midnight, she found $4 million bleeding out of the books through accounts that used her name, and the man who came to collect it was Adrian Lupo, the most dangerous boss on the Eastern Seaboard. He was told she was a debt to be paid. He looked at her once and decided she was something else entirely. That one miscalculation was about to cost the Ashford family everything they had ever built on her silence. The Ashford Grand Hotel sat on Commonwealth Avenue like a monument to good taste. Marble in the lobby, brass on the elevators, a doorman who called every guest by name before they'd said a word. Boston loved the Ashfords quietly and without asking questions, the specific fondness reserved for families whose money is older than anyone's memory of how it was made. Warren Ashford gave the interviews. Trevor Ashford gave the smile for the society pages. And 2 floors below the wine cellar, in a room with no windows and one flickering fluorescent tube, Meredith Ashford gave the hotel its pulse. She was 31 years old, full-bodied in a way she had stopped apologizing, for around the same year she stopped expecting her father to notice her, and she read a balance sheet, the way other people read a room. Size 20, soft through the hips and shoulders, with dark hair she wore pinned back out of habit rather than vanity, and a face that had learned very young how to hold still under an insult. She was not hiding down here because she was ashamed of her body. She was hiding because her family had decided, a long time ago, that a woman shaped like her belonged out of the light, and she had been too tired, too broke, and too responsible for 300 employees' paychecks to fight them on it every single day. So she fought them the only way that mattered. She kept the numbers honest. She kept the lights on. She kept the whole gleaming lie of the Ashford name solvent, one invoice at a time, long after everyone upstairs had stopped bothering to say thank you. Tonight, the numbers were not honest. She had been chasing a security invoice for 40 minutes, a firm called Northgate Protective, that supposedly staffed the East Wing during a renovation that had, according to every schedule she kept memorized, never required outside security at all. One strange invoice was an error. 3 was a pattern. 26, spread across 9 months and buried under vendor names built to look like each other, was something else. She followed it patiently, without blinking, the same discipline she brought to everything else in that basement, until the number at the bottom of her screen made her sit back in her chair like the room had tilted. Almost $4 million, laundered through phantom renovation crews, and a shuttered sister property called the Ashford Imperial, a hotel that had been closed for 6 years and was, according to her father, worth nothing but sentiment. She had always assumed her brother skimmed a little here and there to cover his poker debts. This was not skimming. This was a tunnel someone had carved through the family's accounts, wide enough to move a fortune in the dark. And at the bottom of the final wire transfer, in the memo line, nobody was ever supposed to read this closely, sat a name she recognized the way you recognize weather turning: Lupo. We post a new story like this every single day. Subscribe so you never miss one. Meredith had seen him exactly once, 3 years earlier, crossing the lobby during an ice storm without bothering to remove his gloves, and she remembered how the entire front desk staff had gone quiet before they'd consciously decided to. Adrian Lupo did not run a company that filed disclosures. He ran restaurants that never had an empty table and warehouses near the port that nobody asked questions about. And he was, by every account whispered in the staff break room, young for the kind of fear he commanded, and patient only, until patience stopped being useful to him. He drove a matte black Maybach that never idled anywhere for long. He wore Tom Ford like other men wore armor, and somewhere under the tailoring, people said, he kept a Glock he'd never once needed to draw twice on the same man. And if his name was sitting inside a laundering scheme running through her family's books, then whatever Trevor had done this time was not a scandal the Ashfords could bury with a donation and a smile. She had grown up hearing his name, the way you learn certain streets are best avoided after dark, long before anyone explained why. A fact of the city rather than a person in it. Boston's oldest families spoke of him at charity dinners in careful half-sentences, admiring his restraint, fearing his patience, and never once inviting him to sit at the actual table. Meredith had always assumed a man like that would never have reason to look twice at a records room in the basement of somebody else's hotel. She had been wrong about a great many things in her life. She was about to be wrong about that one most of all. She was still staring at the screen, printer coughing out evidence with shaking pages, when the hallway outside went quiet, in a way that basements at midnight were never quiet. No laundry carts, no night porter humming to himself. Footsteps, several sets, closing in on a door that had no other way out. Warren Ashford came through first, silver-haired and unbothered, the same calm he wore for cameras, stitched onto his face like it cost nothing. Trevor followed, golden and smirking, already amused at whatever was about to happen to her. Behind them stood men she didn't know, wide-shouldered and silent, in a way that had nothing to do with hotel security. And then the last man stepped into the doorway, and the small room seemed to shrink 2 sizes around him. Adrian Lupo did not look like a hotel emergency. He looked like weather that had decided to come indoors. Black coat, dark hair combed back from a face too controlled to be handsome in any ordinary sense, and eyes that moved once over the room, the monitors, the coffee mug, the stacks of files, before settling on Meredith and staying there. Most men glanced past her quickly, out of either discomfort or dismissal. He did not glance. He looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door he has decided to open. "Meredith," her father said, tasting her name like something unpleasant. "Stand up. What is this?" Trevor laughed, soft and delighted. "She really doesn't know." "That's sweet." Warren stepped further in, careful not to let his sleeve brush the filing cabinets, as if poverty were contagious. "Mr. Lupo has a serious financial matter with this family. We have reason to believe you're involved." The words floated past her at first, refusing to land. Involved. Trevor was already circling behind that word, like he'd been waiting all night to say it. "Don't play innocent, Mary. The shell accounts are yours. Your login, your signature, your access codes. Northgate Protective, Harborline Consulting, Imperial Restoration Group. Cute names. Didn't know you had it in you." The blood left her face in one long drop. "I didn't build those accounts." "Funny," Trevor said, "how every trail leads back to you anyway." She looked at her father, waiting, foolishly, for one word in her defense after 10 years of proving herself with nothing but overtime and silence. Warren looked instead at the printed pages on her desk and said, to a man he was clearly afraid of, "She's always been difficult. Unstable when questioned. I should have watched her more closely." The floor tilted under her. "You know that isn't true." He didn't answer. Trevor crossed the room, unhurried, and crouched so his voice landed only for her. "Be useful for once," he said, and something in her chest that had absorbed every version of that sentence for a decade finally cracked clean through. Adrian had not spoken. That, somehow, was the most frightening part of the whole room. He simply watched, gloved hands loose at his sides, while a father sold his own daughter's name to save himself. "I found the missing money tonight," Meredith said, her voice thinner than she wanted, but steady enough to hold. "I was tracing it when they walked in. The vendor codes don't match the renovation schedule. No security crew was ever posted on those dates. Someone used my credentials. I didn't approve a single one of those transfers." "Enough," Warren snapped. "No," Meredith said, and surprised even herself with how clean it came out. "Not enough. I've spent 10 years cleaning up every mess this family makes, and I know exactly what a lie looks like in a ledger. This is one." Trevor's charm dropped away, revealing something meaner underneath it. "You hear that, Mr. Lupo? She always does this. Sits down here every night because nobody upstairs wants to look at her, and somehow that makes her queen of the hotel." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Adrian finally moved, crossing to her desk and lifting one of the invoices, reading it with an attention that made the paper look like it might catch fire. "The missing money is mine," he said, low, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than a shout would have been. "Your father promised me collateral if it wasn't found by tonight." Something in Meredith's throat closed. "Collateral?" Trevor's smile didn't reach his eyes this time. "You." The word opened a hole in her she hadn't known was still empty enough to fall through. Her father looked at the wall, not at her, not once. And in that single refusal, Meredith understood with a clarity that felt like ice under skin. They had never been trying to solve the theft at all. They had been building her a grave and writing her name on the stone long before she'd ever walked into this room. Adrian folded the invoice and set it down. "Take her," he said, and two of his men stepped forward, and Meredith did not fight, because something inside her had already gone too quiet for that. They walked her past the employee lockers where the housekeeping staff had once hung birthday cards for her because they had more warmth in their small kindnesses than her own blood had ever managed. Trevor lifted a hand in a lazy little wave as the black SUV door closed. Warren said nothing at all. Meredith Ashford disappeared from the hotel she had kept alive for a decade, and nobody upstairs even slowed the party to notice. The drive out of the city took nearly an hour, past the harbor and the last of the streetlights, through iron gates into an estate wrapped in dark trees. Adrian sat across from her the entire way, gaze mostly on his phone, though she could feel him tracking every breath she took, like a man counting something he intended to keep exact records of. The house beyond the gates was old stone, black windows, the kind of beautiful that belongs to a storm out at sea, better admired than survived. Inside, it smelled of cedar and leather, and a fire burning somewhere deep in the walls. They put her in a guest suite larger than her apartment, dark wood, heavy curtains, small black cameras watching quietly from the corners, and locked the door behind her. She barely slept for 2 days. Food came on silver trays and went back mostly untouched. She kept waiting for a final question, a verdict, something to end the waiting. Instead, the silence simply stretched, and by the second night her grief had grown heavier than her fear, because her family hadn't just betrayed her tonight. They had proven, once and for all, what she had suspected her whole life, that to them, she had never been a daughter. She had been labor, wearing the family name. On the third night, the lock clicked, and Adrian came in alone. No guards, a thin folder in one hand. He closed the door with a precision that made even that small motion feel deliberate. Meredith stood too fast, dizzy from hunger, still in the same wrinkled blouse from the basement. "Sit," he said. "I'd rather stand." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite amusement. "Then stand." He spread the pages across the little table between them. "The shell accounts are tied to your credentials. Your signature is on 6 contracts. Explain that." She looked down at her own name, forged well enough to fool anyone who hadn't watched her sign payroll at 2 in the morning for 10 straight years. "I didn't do it." "That isn't an explanation. It's the truth," she said, and something in her finally broke open. Not loudly, just enough to let everything through. "My father has hidden me in back offices since I was old enough to understand shame. My brother has mocked my body since we were children. They call me lazy while I do the work they're too spoiled to learn. They tell people no one would ever want a woman shaped like me, and for years I believed them, because they said it with such confidence. They used my passwords because I run the real audits. They used my signature because I sign legitimate contracts every week. They knew the trail would look natural leading back to me, because I'm the one person nobody in that family would ever defend." Her voice shook but didn't stop. "They didn't give you collateral, Mr. Lupo. They gave you a body they expected you to make disappear." The room went very still. Something tightened around Adrian's eyes, a shadow crossing behind all that careful control. He stepped closer, slow enough that she could have moved away, and she didn't. He drew off one glove, finger by finger, and when his bare thumb brushed the tear off her cheek, the gentleness of it frightened her worse than any threat could have. "Your family made a mistake," he said. "Only one?" Her laugh came out broken. His mouth didn't smile, but something dark and certain settled over his face. "They assumed I punish the innocent because cowards need someone to point at. They also assumed I wouldn't know the difference between guilt and grief." He turned toward the door and spoke to the men waiting outside it. "Find Warren Ashford and his son, alive." Then he looked back at her, and for the first time, his eyes didn't measure her like a problem that needed solving. "You are not my prisoner anymore, Meredith Ashford. From this moment, you are under my protection." She didn't know. Standing there in a stranger's guest suite, with her whole family's cruelty finally spoken out loud, whether she was more afraid of dying or of finally being seen clearly enough to matter. Later, she would try to explain to herself why his words had undone her more thoroughly than any threat could have, and the closest she ever came was this. For 10 years, she had braced for punishment every time she opened her mouth, and instead, a man everyone in Boston crossed the street to avoid had knelt at eye level with her grief and called it by its correct name. It was such a small thing, being believed. She had not known how much of her life she had spent starving for exactly that, until it was finally set in front of her, like a meal she no longer trusted herself to eat without flinching. She slept that night, uneven and thin, but real. In the morning, the house had changed shape around her, guards moving with new purpose, phones ringing behind closed doors, the whole estate breathing like something large had opened one eye. A woman named Celeste arrived that afternoon with garment bags and a measuring tape, and did not ask Meredith's size with the tight little smile of a saleswoman who had already decided what wouldn't fit her. She simply said Adrian wanted her dressed properly for the evening, and Meredith, who had spent 31 years dressing like an apology, said she didn't need a gown. "You're going back to an Ashford hotel tonight," Celeste said, and the words moved through her like cold water. The dress, when it came out of the bag, was deep emerald velvet, heavy and rich, sleeves that skimmed her arms, a neckline that opened without exposing more than she wanted, a waist shaped to honor the softness underneath, rather than fight it. It felt intentional in a way nothing in her closet ever had, as if someone had looked at the space she took up in the world and decided it deserved to be beautiful. When it settled on her body and she looked in the mirror, the woman looking back did not look small or hidden. She looked wide and soft and entirely her own, and underneath the fear on her face, there was something her father had spent years trying to kill: presence. Adrian came in without knocking and stopped. His gaze moved over her slowly, not with surprise, not with the hungry, mocking heat Trevor had always warned her men would never feel for a woman built like her, but with something closer to recognition, as if a truth had simply become visible, that had been standing in front of him the whole time. "Your family was blind," he said. "They saw me every day." "No," he said quietly. "They saw what they'd already decided to hate." He offered his hand. "Tonight, you'll see them clearly too." The Ashford Imperial waited at the edge of the city, like a ghost that had refused to leave, its stone face streaked with weather, its grand windows dark behind 6 years of dust. Adrian's men had opened the service entrance, and Meredith followed him beneath dead chandeliers into the ruined ballroom, moonlight falling in broken pieces across covered furniture and a dance floor gone gray with neglect. At the far end, bound to 2 heavy chairs beneath a crooked chandelier, sat her father and her brother, suits wrinkled, Trevor's lips split, Warren's silver hair finally out of place. For the first time in her life, they didn't look powerful. They looked like 2 frightened men, dragged somewhere their last name meant nothing at all. Trevor saw her first, and his face twisted worse at her beauty than it ever had at her fear. "What is this? You dress her up and think it changes anything?" Adrian lifted one hand a fraction, and one of his men stepped forward, and whatever Trevor meant to say next died before it left his throat. "Let him talk," Meredith said, surprising herself. Adrian glanced at her. "You're sure? I want to hear what he says when he can't send me back downstairs." Trevor's face twisted. "You think standing next to him makes you important? You're still the same pathetic girl hiding in a basement. You think a man like that wants you? Men like him collect useful things. That's all you'll ever be to him." The old bruises stirred, but for once they passed through her instead of breaking anything on the way out. If her heart already belongs to Adrian the way this feels, subscribe and see where it leads. She looked at Trevor's bound hands, the same polished fingers that had signed forged documents in her name 100 times. "You used my signature," she said. "You used my passwords because I run the real audits. You built the shell vendors through the Imperial because you knew I'd catch a missing labor report before I'd notice an old storage permit. You made the trail look like my work because you knew my work better than anyone in this family ever bothered to." Warren tried command and found only rust. "Meredith, enough. We can settle this as a family." "We were never a family," she said, turning to him at last. "You proved that the night you handed me to a man you thought might kill me." "You don't understand what was at stake?" "I do," she said. "Your image. Trevor's freedom. The hotels, your dinners, your clubs, your name, all of it mattered more than I did. Adrian set a folder on the dusty table beside them. My people traced $4 million, moved through shell vendors, approved with access keys, stolen from Meredith's office. That alone would be enough. He let the silence stretch. You also sold my private routes, service schedules, loading dock codes, storage access, to the Dragunov network. Warren's face went the color of old paper. Meredith looked at him and felt the last soft thing inside her finally give out. So it's true. Trevor was already shaking his head. That wasn't serious. It was information. They were never supposed to move against you. Men who sell doors, Adrian said, don't get to decide who walks through them. Meredith opened the folder herself, and the numbers began speaking to her, the way they always had: dates, transfer trails, renovation schedules, elevator logs, until the shape of the whole scheme sat clear in her mind like a floor plan. The Imperial wasn't just storage, she said slowly. It was a transfer point. The false crews came in on nights the service elevator was logged as out of service, but it was never actually broken. You closed it on paper, so nobody would question why the basement cameras went dark for repairs. She turned another page. The Dragunov payments are folded into restoration line items: window repair, marble replacement, mold remediation, but the numbers are too clean. Rounded twice a month. You weren't only stealing from Adrian, you were charging the Dragunov network to use Ashford properties as a quiet way into his territory. One of Adrian's men checked a phone and nodded once. Adrian's gaze stayed on her, something sharper than pride moving across his face, the look of a dangerous man realizing he had found someone worth more than the revenge he'd walked in planning to take. This company belongs to this family, Warren said, breath going uneven. Whatever you think I've done, I built this. No, Meredith said. You posed beside it. I kept it alive. She took the pen Adrian set beside the transfer documents, her hand steady after one small tremor, and signed her name in the same signature they had stolen to bury her. Only this time, it belonged entirely to her. Warren looked empty when she finished. Trevor only looked hateful. She walked out of the ballroom beside Adrian and did not look back. Warren and Trevor Ashford did not die in that forgotten hotel. Adrian did not believe in simple endings for men who built complicated betrayals, and by the end of the week, federal investigators had account trails, fraud records, and enough proof of laundering hidden inside 6 years of renovation invoices to bury the Ashford name for good. Warren's face disappeared from charity boards. Trevor's friends stopped returning his calls. The name Ashford became something Boston whispered with pity instead of envy, and Meredith did not visit either of them, did not write, did not wait for an apology that had never once been coming. She moved out of the basement and into the top floor of the flagship hotel, though she kept the old records room untouched for a while, not as punishment, but as proof of what she had survived down there. She walked the lobby now in clothes made for her body instead of against it, fired the managers who had grown fat on stolen overtime, restored the wages her father had quietly cut, replaced the vendors Trevor had used as a personal wallet. The hotels breathed for the first time in years. Some mornings, she still caught herself lowering her voice out of old habit, softening a request before she'd finished asking it, and had to remind herself there was no one left upstairs to overhear and punish her for taking up space. It took longer than she expected to unlearn 10 years of making herself small in doorways. She did it anyway, one meeting at a time, one raised voice at a time, until the staff who had once looked away from her in the hallway started looking for her instead, the way people look for someone whose word they can actually trust. Adrian stayed close, but never at the head of her table, standing behind her chair when it mattered, listening when the numbers came up, watching her become something the underworld hadn't planned for. At first they called her his soft new wife, though the wedding hadn't happened yet, and assumed she was decoration wrapped in velvet, a rescued woman with a sad story and a dangerous protector. Then, one by one, men who underestimated her found their accounts frozen, their routes exposed, their lies caught before they ever became threats. Meredith reviewed Adrian's world the same way she'd reviewed her father's, quietly, patiently, until she found a duplicate payment buried in a port security chain, a warehouse manager running outdated inventory codes to hide missing crates, a leak moving through a florist who served 3 private clubs and reported deliveries on nights Adrian's men moved cash. She did not shout when she found things. She simply remembered them, and in Adrian's world, memory turned out to be more dangerous than a gun. There were nights, in that first winter, when Adrian found her still awake over his own ledgers at 2 in the morning, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a mug of tea gone cold at her elbow, and he would stand in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to before crossing the room. He never told her to stop. He would simply pull a chair close enough that his shoulder brushed hers and read over the numbers in silence until she found what she was looking for. And on the nights she leaned her head briefly against him, without seeming to notice she'd done it, he stayed very still, as if any sudden movement might remind her to pull away. He had spent his whole adult life being feared. He had not understood, until her, how much he'd wanted to be trusted instead. Their wedding happened in winter, private and candlelit, in the restored chapel of the Ashford Imperial, before it reopened to the public. She wore ivory satin with emerald stones at her throat. Adrian placed the ring on her finger with the same careful focus he gave every promise he intended to keep. He didn't promise her an easy life. She wouldn't have believed him if he had. He promised truth, protection, and a place beside him no one would ever be permitted to question again. When he kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a man claiming something helpless. It was the kiss of a man who had found his equal in the one woman his world had been foolish enough to throw away. The grand reopening of the Ashford Imperial came 6 months later, and Boston had never seen anything like it. The old hotel glowed again, its stone face washed clean, its ballroom restored beneath a chandelier that looked like a captured galaxy. Politicians smiled for cameras. Judges pretended not to recognize the men their courts had once tried. Champagne moved through the room on silver trays, and at the center of it stood Meredith Lupo, no longer hidden beneath the hotel but ruling above it, black velvet and an emerald pendant resting warm at her throat. Adrian stood beside her, alert in the way she had learned to read, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his eyes touched every exit before returning to her face. Earlier, in the quiet of the bridal suite while Celeste fussed with the last pin in her hair, he had come to find her alone, and for one long, unhurried moment, neither of them had said anything at all. He had traced one finger along her jaw and leaned close enough that she felt his breath before the door opened behind them and pulled them both back into the noise of the evening, and she had spent the next hour half aware of him across every crowded room, waiting for that moment to finish. She was mid-conversation with a city councilwoman about historic preservation when she saw the first mistake. 3 maintenance workers came through the East Service corridor carrying equipment cases, and nobody else in the ballroom would have noticed, because hotels were always full of people moving quietly through side doors. But Meredith had approved the staffing schedule herself. The real crew had been moved west for fresh floor sealant. These badges were the old design, retired 2 weeks earlier. And their boots weren't work boots at all. Black, clean, made for grip instead of labor. The Dragunov network had finally come to collect the door Warren had once sold them. She didn't scream. Panic would only send guests running straight into whatever these men had planned. She touched the emerald pendant at her throat, the private signal she and Adrian had built after too many nights studying every possible way someone could come for him, and let her champagne glass slip from her fingers. It shattered against the marble, and to the room it looked like a small accident, followed by a sudden power flicker. The lights dimmed. The music swelled. Waiters guided the important guests toward the West Gallery with smooth, practiced urgency, while Adrian's men closed in like shadows, finding their shape. One of the intruders reached into his case and found Meredith standing directly in front of him, calm as moonlight. "Wrong corridor," she said, and his half-second of surprise was long enough for a guard to take him from behind. Another drew a weapon, but Meredith had already stepped behind a pillar and hit the hidden alarm beneath the service panel. Steel doors dropped across the corridor exits, sealing the attackers away from 300 guests who never even heard the gunfire that followed, muffled by old stone and new security glass. She walked back into the open before fear could spread through the room, took the microphone with a steadiness that surprised even her, and said the Imperial's historic wiring had decided to remind everyone it was dramatic, and asked their guests to please allow the staff to guide them into the West Gallery while it was corrected. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. People obeyed, because Meredith sounded like a woman who expected to be obeyed. It was over in under 4 minutes. No guest was hurt. Every Dragunov man was captured through the same hidden corridors her father had once sold to betray them. Later she would learn that 2 of them had come armed with a floor plan of the Imperial, nearly a decade old, still marked with the old fire codes she herself had helped rewrite the year she turned 25, and there was a strange, private satisfaction in knowing the last thing standing between her husband and a bullet had been a filing decision she'd made in the basement no one upstairs had ever bothered to thank her for. Adrian found her alone by the grand staircase afterward, one hand pressed to her stomach, as the delayed shake of it finally reached her, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of how close it had all come and how clean she had walked through it anyway. He took her face in both hands. "Are you hurt?" "Angry," she said. A slow, dangerous smile crossed his mouth. "Good." She laughed, small and broken, and then she was crying, not from fear, but from the sheer distance she'd traveled to get here. The basement girl, the family's convenient scapegoat, the collateral handed over like an old debt, now standing in a hotel she'd saved with her own hands, beside a man who had never once asked her to be smaller for him. New stories go up every single day, so subscribe now and let tomorrow night's story find you. Years later, people in Boston would still lower their voices when they talked about Meredith Lupo, how she could read a ledger like a signed confession, how she knew every hallway in every property she owned, and every weakness in every deal, before it had the chance to grow teeth. They would say Adrian Lupo loved her with a devotion so complete it made even reckless men careful around her. But those who knew the whole truth understood love had only opened the door. She had walked through it herself, on her own 2 feet, in a body she had finally stopped apologizing for. On quiet nights, when the Ashford Imperial glowed against the Boston skyline and the harbor wind pressed soft against the windows, Meredith sometimes came back to the ballroom after the last guest had gone home and found Adrian already there beneath the chandelier, watching the light with a calm, unreadable smile. He never asked if she missed the life before him. He knew better. She missed nothing about being unseen, nothing about begging for space inside a family that had locked the door on her a long time before they ever handed her to a stranger in black gloves. "What are you thinking?" he asked one evening, sliding his hand into hers. She looked across the restored ballroom, remembering the night she'd walked in wearing emerald velvet while her father and brother stared at her like they were seeing her for the very first time. "That they were right about one thing," she said. "I was difficult." Adrian turned his head toward her, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. "No," he said. "You were inevitable." She leaned into him as the chandelier threw gold across the walls of the empire she had saved, claimed, and rebuilt in her own name, and outside, Boston kept its secrets the way it always had, quietly and without asking questions. Inside, the woman they had tried to erase stood beside the most dangerous man on the Eastern Seaboard, not as his secret, not as his weakness, and not as anyone's burden ever again. She was Meredith Lupo, owner of the Ashford Grand, mistress of the Imperial, wife of Adrian Lupo, and living, unshrinking proof that the world's oldest mistake is underestimating a woman who spent her whole life learning how to be underestimated in silence.